My name is Joanna Park. I'm 38 years old. My uncle David spent 4 years very carefully transferring my parents' dry cleaning business into his name. He used my mother's limited English against her. He used my father's illness against him. He used documents my parents couldn't fully read, signed with notaries he arranged, at times he controlled. He was careful about almost everything. He was not careful about an email he sent to a business consultant in 2018, 4 years before I found it. An email that had been forwarded to my mother's account, which she couldn't read, and which had sat in her inbox unnoticed for 4 years. Before I tell you what that email said, hit subscribe, hit like, and tell us from where you are watching this video in comments, and let me show you what 30 years of my parents' work was worth, and why it deserved to be protected. My parents, Sung-Ho Park and Myrae Park, came to Seattle from Busan in 1987. They were both 24 years old. They had $500 between them, a connection to a distant cousin in the Rainier Valley, and the specific combination of terror and resolution that seems to accompany people who have made an irreversible decision and are proceeding anyway. My father worked in a restaurant kitchen for 3 years. My mother did alterations for a dry cleaner on Rainier Avenue, learning the machines, learning the chemicals, learning the specific technical knowledge that turns fabric care from a service into a craft. She was good at it. She had grown up watching her mother sew and had the particular spatial intelligence that makes someone understand how cloth works, how it moves, how it yields, how it can be coerced without being damaged. In 1991, they opened Park's Dry Cleaning on a section of Beacon Hill that was, at that time, largely Korean American in its commercial character, and that has since changed in the way of Seattle neighborhoods. But that still has, in my memory, the specific smell of the Saturday mornings when I was small and my parents took me with them, because there was no one else to watch me, and the shop was where they were. The shop was 2 storefronts, the front for drop-off and pickup, the back for the actual cleaning. My father managed the front. My mother ran the back. They had 2 employees from the beginning, both community members, people my parents had known from church. They were open 6 days a week, closed Sunday, because Sunday was church. They built it, over 30 years, into a business that employed 6 people, served several thousand regular customers, had accounts with 3 downtown hotels, and had, in 2018, a valuation that a business broker told them was substantial. My father had a stroke in 2019. He was 56 years old. He survived it, but with significant effects on his cognition and his speech. He could communicate slowly, with effort, but he was no longer able to manage the day-to-day operations of the business. My mother, at 56, was running the business almost entirely alone, except for the employees, and except for my father's younger brother David, who had been a peripheral presence in my parents' business lives for years, and who, after my father's stroke, offered to help. She accepted the help. She trusted him. He was family. He was also the most methodical deceiver I have ever encountered, and I have, in the years since, thought a great deal about what makes someone capable of doing what he did. I think the answer is, he did not think my mother and I would understand what he was doing until it was too late to undo it. He thought the language gap and my mother's trust and my father's incapacity were sufficient insulation. He was wrong. But he almost wasn't. I want to give you the business as it actually was, because what David tried to take was not an abstraction. Park's Dry Cleaning, by 2019, was a going concern with a 30-year reputation and an established customer base that included a genuinely impressive loyalty rate. My parents had customers who had been bringing their clothes to them for 25 years. This is not because dry cleaning is a product that inspires loyalty naturally. It is because my parents treated every garment as if it belonged to someone who cared about it, which was true, and as if their professional reputation depended on getting it right, which was also true. My mother had a particular gift for problem garments, the difficult fabrics, the stains that other cleaners turned away, the vintage pieces that required specific knowledge and specific solvents in specific concentrations. She had, over 30 years, accumulated a body of expertise that was not written down anywhere, and that lived entirely in her hands and her memory. The hotel accounts had come from a specific incident in 2005 when a concierge from a downtown property had brought in a tablecloth that had been destroyed at an event and asked, as a last resort, if anything could be done. My mother had done something with it that the concierge had not believed was possible. The hotel account followed within a week. My father had run the front of the house with a warmth that was, in retrospect, a significant competitive advantage. He knew his customers. He remembered names, occasions, preferences. He knew which customers wanted their shirts done a certain way and remembered without being told. This sounds like a small thing. Over 30 years, it was an enormous thing. After the stroke, my father sat near the window at the front of the shop when he was well enough to be there. He could still recognize customers. He could still nod and smile, and occasionally, with effort, say a name. The regulars treated this as normal. They spoke to him the same way they always had, maybe a little more slowly. The dignity of that still moves me. My mother managed everything else. She was at the shop by 6:30 every morning. She was there until 6 or 7 every evening. She attended church on Sunday, and she rested for a few hours, and she was back on Monday. She did not ask for help, because asking for help was not her mode. When David offered, she accepted because family helping family was a principle she had organized her life around. What she did not fully understand, and this is not a reflection of her intelligence, which was significant. It is a reflection of a language gap that David had spent years understanding, and that he used with precision, was that the documents David was bringing for her to sign were not the administrative assistants he described them as. They were transfers. I am going to tell you about the email. David Park was 51 years old when my father had his stroke. He had spent his career in business consulting, a vague and flexible description that covered, in his case, a range of activities including some that were legitimate and some that, I would later learn, were at the edges of legitimate. He had always been the younger brother, which in a Korean family of a particular generation carries specific resonances. The one who had more freedom, the one who had not had to take on the early responsibilities, the one whose path had been eased by the groundwork the elder brother laid. He had come to Seattle 7 years after my parents, with more education and more English, and had built a career that was respectable looking from the outside, and that had, on closer examination, some structural issues that I will describe when they become relevant. He was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He was someone who had decided, at some point before I can specifically identify, that the business my parents had built represented an opportunity, and that the particular circumstances of my father's incapacity and my mother's language limitations represented a window. He began helping in early 2020. He came to the shop several times a week. He said he would handle the administrative side, correspondence, vendor agreements, any paperwork that was requiring my mother's attention. He said, "Myre, you focus on the work. I'll handle the business side." My mother, who was 57 years old and working 60 hours a week, and managing a household that included my father's care needs, said yes. She said yes because David was family, and because the offer was presented as generosity, and because she was exhausted in a specific way that comes from having done everything for 30 years and suddenly having to do more. I was in Seattle, 20 minutes from Beacon Hill, working as a graphic designer. I came to the shop on weekends. I helped when I could. I offered to be more involved in the business side, and my mother said, "David is handling it. It is fine." I trusted her trust in him. I should not have. The first time I had a specific reason to be concerned was in October 2020, when my mother mentioned, in passing, as if it were unremarkable, that David had had her sign some forms to update the business's registered agent with the state. I said, "What kind of forms?" She said, "Business forms." He explained them. I said, "Did you read them?" She said, "David read them to me." David had read them to her in English, which she understood imperfectly, explaining them in Korean, which he controlled, and in which he had described them as administrative updates rather than what they were. I asked her for copies. She said she hadn't kept copies. David had taken them. I searched the Washington Secretary of State Business Registry that evening. The registered agent for Parks Dry Cleaning, LLC, had been changed to an entity called Pacific Crest Business Services. Pacific Crest Business Services was registered to David Park. I called my mother. She said, "Oh yes." He said that would make it easier to handle correspondence. I said, "Does easier correspondence require putting his company as registered agent?" He said yes. I said I would look into it. That was October 2020. Over the following 14 months, until I found the email in December 2021, David made 7 additional filings with the state and with King County regarding Parks Dry Cleaning. Each one moved some element of the business's legal structure toward his control. Each one was executed with my mother's signature or with the authority of a power of attorney that David had arranged in 2020. A document my mother had signed, which she believed authorized David to handle business correspondence, and which actually gave him broad authority over business decisions. Warren Kessler would have recognized the structure. It was the same one. The language was the weapon. My mother's trust was the opening, and my father's incapacity was the reason she needed help in the first place. That is the architecture of what David built. It took me 14 months to fully understand it, 1 forwarded email to prove it, and 2 years of legal work to undo it. Let me tell you about the email. In December 2021, I was at my parents' house helping my mother organize some paperwork. My father was in the other room, resting. My mother had a laptop she used primarily for video calls with relatives in Busan. She had learned to use it for that specific purpose and for very little else. She had a Gmail account that I had set up for her in 2018. I used it to send her things occasionally, family photos, Korean language recipe videos, the occasional document. She checked it irregularly. She did not know how to use the search function. That December, I was trying to find a vendor invoice she thought might have been emailed to her. I sat down at her laptop and logged into her Gmail. The invoice was not there or not easily found, but as I was scrolling, something caught my eye. An email received in August 2018, 3 years earlier, with a subject line that read, FWD, Ray Park Acquisition Timeline. It had been forwarded to my mother's account from an address I did not recognize. My mother had not opened it. It had sat, marked unread, for 3 years in her inbox among the recipe videos and family photos. I opened it. It was a forwarded chain of 3 emails. The original was from David Park to someone named Brian Cho, described in his email signature as a business transition consultant based in Bellevue. The chain was dated August 2018, a full year before my father's stroke. I am going to tell you what David wrote in the original email, because I have read it enough times to have it memorized. He wrote, Brian wanted to follow up on our conversation. As we discussed, the timing here depends on a triggering event. Sung-ho's health has been a concern for a while. Something is likely to happen in the next year or 2 that creates the opening. Once that happens, Myrae will need support and won't have the bandwidth to manage the business details. That's when we move. I need the structure to be clean before then so it looks administrative. The goal is that by the time anyone thinks to look at it, the business is already mine and it's too late to unwind it. Let me know when you can meet. That is what my uncle wrote, a year before my father's stroke. That is his voice, in his words, in an email he sent in 2018 and apparently did not realize had been forwarded by Brian Cho, whose relationship with my mother's email address I still do not fully understand, to the person he was planning to exploit. I sat at my mother's kitchen table with this email on the screen for a very long time. Then I forwarded it to my own account. I took screenshots. I wrote down the date, the sender, the recipients, the full text. Then I closed the laptop and I went to the kitchen and I made tea because I needed something to do with my hands. And I sat with my mother and we drank tea and I said nothing about what I had found. I called an attorney the next morning. The attorney I called was a woman named Christine Yoon, who had been recommended by a friend in the Korean American community as someone who understood both business litigation and the specific legal vulnerabilities faced by immigrant business owners. She was 45, had practiced business and estate law in Seattle for 15 years, and had, she told me in our first meeting, handled several cases involving what she described as language-assisted exploitation, situations where a language gap had been deliberately used to manage someone's understanding of documents they were signing. I told her everything. I told her about the registered agent change in October 2020. I told her about the power of attorney my mother had signed. I told her about the 7 subsequent filings. I told her about the email. She said, "The email is extraordinary." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you understand what it establishes?" I said, "It establishes that he planned this before my father's stroke." She said, "It establishes premeditation. It establishes that the exploitation was not opportunistic, not something he decided to do when circumstances created an opening, but something he had designed in advance and was waiting to execute. This is not a case about a family member who helped and gradually took advantage. This is a case about a family member who identified a future vulnerability and built a plan around it." She said, "The email is going to be the center of everything." She said, "How is your mother?" I said, "She doesn't know the full extent of it yet. I've told her some things. I haven't shown her the email." She said, "We'll need to tell her everything. She is, despite the power of attorney David arranged, still a principal in the business. Her testimony will matter." My mother's testimony, when she eventually gave it, was one of the most difficult things I have sat through. Not because she was not credible, she was entirely credible, precise and clear and consistent. But because watching her describe, in Korean through an interpreter, the specific ways she had been deceived, how David had explained things to her that were not what he said, how she had trusted him because he was family, how she had believed the forms she was signing were administrative, was watching a woman of integrity and intelligence describe being systematically used. She did not cry in the deposition. She was, as she always was, composed. But at one point, when David's attorney suggested that she had fully understood the power of attorney she had signed, she said, and the interpreter translated this with the specific bluntness my mother intended, "I understood that I was giving him permission to help with correspondence. If he had told me what it actually said, I would not have signed it." The attorney asked, "You're saying you didn't understand the document?" She said, "I'm saying he didn't explain it honestly. There is a difference." That difference, between not understanding and being misled about what you were agreeing to, was the center of Christine's case. The power of attorney, obtained without independent counsel, with translation provided exclusively by David, was challenged on grounds of fraud in the inducement. Every filing made under the power of attorney was challenged. Every transfer of business interest was challenged. The email was Exhibit A. The shop next to Park's Dry Cleaning was a Korean grocery run by Sunyi Kim, who had been a neighbor on Beacon Hill for 26 years. She was 68 years old, had known my parents since they opened, and had what I can only describe as a comprehensive awareness of everything that happened in and around that block. She had observed David's increased presence at the shop from the beginning of 2020. She had her own assessment of it. I want to tell you what she said to me, because the way she said it has stayed with me. I came to see her in January 2022 after Christine had asked me to identify anyone who had observed David's conduct at the business. Mrs. Kim invited me into the back of the grocery and made barley tea and said, before I had asked anything, "I know why you're here. I've been waiting." She said, "I knew something was wrong when he started coming every day. Your father, God bless him, came every day. David never came. Then he started coming every day, but like someone checking on an investment, not like someone helping family." She said, "One day your mother left the shop for a delivery. She handles a pickup every Tuesday for the restaurant on Graham, and David was alone in the shop for 45 minutes. That is not helping. That is being alone in someone's business." She had seen him make calls from the front counter when he thought he was unobserved. She had seen him photographing documents with his phone. She had seen him, in October 2021, meet two men outside the shop. She did not know who they were and show them something on his phone that appeared to be a photograph of the interior layout. She had written some of these things down because she was, she said, the kind of person who wrote things down. Her notes were not in a spiral notebook like Beatrice Acker's. They were in the same notebook she used for inventory, dates in the margin, brief observations in Korean. Christine had them translated. Every entry was specific, dated, and consistent with what we could establish from other sources. She gave a full statement in both Korean and English. She said, "Myrae and Sung-ho have worked on that block for 30 years. I have been there for 30 years. I know what their business looks like. What David was doing did not look like helping." Christine used Mrs. Kim's observations to establish a pattern of conduct that went beyond individual transactions, to demonstrate that David had been systematically treating the business as his own property in his behavior, his access, and his actions, well before any of the transfer documents had been filed. This mattered because David's defense was going to be that he had been a legitimate business manager, exercising authority appropriately granted to him. The pattern of conduct Mrs. Kim described was inconsistent with legitimate management. It was consistent with the email. Mrs. Kim, on the stand, was exactly herself. When David's attorney suggested she might be misinterpreting what she had seen, she said, "I have run a business on that street for 26 years. I know the difference between someone helping and someone taking. My father died in March 2022, 3 months after I found the email, and while the legal case was in its early stages. He had had a second stroke in February, smaller than the first but damaging in the cumulative way these things are, and the recovery did not go the way the first one had. He was at home, which was where he wanted to be. My mother was there. I was there every day. The morning he died, which was a Sunday in mid-March, I was in the kitchen making coffee and my mother was in the bedroom with him, and at a certain point, the sounds from the bedroom changed and I went in and knew. He was 62 years old. I want to tell you something about my father that is separate from the legal story. He was a man who could make anyone feel welcomed with minimal effort, not through performance, but through genuine attention. He had remembered, for 30 years, the names and preferences of thousands of customers. He had built a business on the belief that people deserved to have their things cared for properly. He had come to Seattle from Busan with $500 and a wife, and had spent 30 years building something from nothing. He died with his wife beside him and his daughter in the next room, in the house he had lived in for 27 years, unaware of what his brother had been doing in the 6 months since the email had been sent and the 12 months before Christine had filed. I was glad in those first days of grief that he had not known. The grief was enough. My mother was smaller in the weeks after. Not smaller literally, she is not a large person. She has never been, but smaller in the specific way of someone who has lost the person who was their reference point. She did not stop working. She did not stop going to the shop. But the shop was different without my father's presence in the window. She told me once, in April, that she was going to keep going because your father spent 30 years on this. She said it the way you say something that requires no explanation. The reason was the reason. I told her what we were doing. I told her about the email. I sat with her at the kitchen table, and I showed it to her on my laptop, and Christine was on the phone, available if my mother had questions. She read it, or rather, she had me read it to her in Korean. I translated it as closely as I could, with Christine confirming key terms. She was quiet for a long time after. She said, "He knew before." I said, "Yes." She said, "He was waiting for your father to get sick." I said, "Yes." She said, "And then he came and said he wanted to help." I said, "Yes." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "How do I help you fight this?" I said, "You already have." She said, "Tell me what else to do." She was 58 years old. Her husband had been gone 3 weeks, and she wanted to know what to do next. She is her 30 years of work. She always has been. Christine's review of the 8 filings David had made since October 2020 revealed the full extent of what he had accomplished. He had transferred the registered agent to his entity, as I have described. He had amended the LLC's operating agreement to give the business manager, himself, under the fraudulent power of attorney, authority over all distribution decisions. He had added himself as a 40% owner through a capital contribution instrument that reflected an alleged loan he had made to the business, a loan for which there was no contemporaneous documentation in the business's records. He had amended the LLC's member records to show this ownership. He had, in his most recent filing in November 2021, filed a management transition document that described himself as the operating manager of record. Christine's assessment: if he had been given one more filing cycle, approximately 3 months, he would have been in a position to claim majority control. He had not had one more filing cycle because I had found the email. Christine filed in King County Superior Court in February 2022. She filed on 7 grounds: fraud in the inducement of the power of attorney, breach of fiduciary duty as a business manager, unlawful transfer of business interests under Washington business entity law, elder exploitation. My mother was 58. Washington's elder financial exploitation statute applies from 50 to certain categories of vulnerable adults, and my mother qualified under the specific language limitations provision: fraudulent misrepresentation, conversion. And a 7th cause of action, specific to the misrepresentation of the loan, that had served as the basis for the ownership stake. She also filed with the Washington State Department of Financial Institutions and with the Attorney General's office, because Brian Cho, the business consultant David had emailed in 2018, appeared to have some involvement in the structure, and their relationship warranted examination. David's attorney was named Grayson Ford. He was experienced and aggressive, and his initial response was 45 pages long. Christine said, "More pages than evidence." The email was Exhibit A in the filing. It appeared on page 4 of Christine's complaint, reproduced in full. She said, "I want it read before anything else. I want whoever looks at this case to know what this was before they know anything else about it." It was the right call. Christine built the case the way my mother built her expertise: slowly, completely, and with absolute attention to what could not be argued around. The email established intent. Mrs. Kim's observations established pattern. My mother's testimony established the mechanism of deception. A forensic accountant named Richard Tran examined the business's financial records from 2019 through 2021 and documented the ways in which David had used his management authority to take distributions to which he was not entitled and to misdirect vendor payments in ways that benefited his other business interests. Richard Tran's findings: in the 22 months between the power of attorney and the date Christine filed suit, David had directed approximately, I will not give a dollar figure per the rules I have set for this channel, but I will say, it was substantial. It was the kind of number that reflected someone treating a business as a personal resource rather than a managed asset. My mother, when Christine told her the number in context, said, "He took those distributions from the shop, from the people who work there." Christine said, "Yes." She said, "Those employees. Some of them have been there 15 years." Christine said, "Yes." My mother did not say anything else. She looked at the window. That was the moment, I think, when it stopped being about the business and became about something larger for her. The 6 employees at Park's Dry Cleaning, 5 of whom had been there for more than 10 years, were people my parents had treated as community, not labor. 2 of them had attended my father's funeral. David had taken from them without knowing or caring who they were. The deposition of David Park was in October 2022. Christine deposed him for 5 hours. I was not in the room. Christine's account, given afterward in her measured professional manner, was that he was, for the first 3 hours, composed and consistent. He maintained that everything he had done was authorized, that the power of attorney was valid, that the capital contribution was documented, that his management of the business had been appropriate and transparent. Then Christine introduced the email. She did not lead to it. She read it aloud without preamble. She said, "Mr. Park, this is an email from your address to Brian Cho, dated August 2018, approximately 14 months before your brother's stroke. Can you read it and tell me whether this is your email?" He was quiet for a long time. He said, "That's taken out of context." Christine said, "Can you explain the context?" He said, "Brian and I were discussing hypothetical scenarios for business consulting engagements." Christine said, "This email refers specifically to your brother Sung-ho by name. It refers to Myrae by name. It refers to a specific business. The goal is that the business is already mine. Can you explain how that is hypothetical?" He said, "Brian and I sometimes used real businesses as case studies." Christine said, "Your brother's business without his knowledge." He said, "It was exploratory." Christine said, "Mr. Park, when you wrote, 'By the time anyone thinks to look at it, the business is already mine,' what did you mean?" A long pause. He said, "I misspoke." Christine said, "In an email." He said, "I expressed things poorly." Christine said, "You wrote, 'Something is likely to happen in the next year or 2 that creates the opening.' What were you anticipating would happen?" He said, "People age, things change. I was thinking about how I could be helpful." Christine said, "You were anticipating your brother's illness." He said, "I was thinking generally about the future." Christine did not argue. She moved on. She said, "I have no further questions." That was the deposition. The email, in David's voice, said everything that needed to be said. Christine did not need to argue. She needed only to make sure it was heard. I want to add something to the deposition account that Christine did not tell me until afterward, because she said she thought I should hear it from her in person. She said, "I want to tell you that at one point during the deposition, David Park looked at the table for approximately 30 seconds without speaking. This was after I read the email and before he claimed it was out of context." She said, "In my experience, 30 seconds of silence in a deposition is a very long time. People fill silence. He didn't. He sat with it." I asked her what she thought he was thinking. She said, "I think he was calculating. I think he was trying to figure out whether the email could be explained. And I think he found the answer to that question before he started talking." I said, "What was the answer?" She said that it couldn't be. "Not really. You can claim context, you can claim poor phrasing, you can do what he did. But the email says what it says. It has his name on it. It has the names of his brother and sister-in-law. It has the word mine. And it predates every event he claims was voluntary and appropriate by more than a year." She said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. I have read a lot of documents. I have rarely read something that clearly describes a plan in someone's own words." She said he made one mistake. He made it in 2018 and he didn't know it was still there. I thought about that. One mistake, 4 years before I found it, sitting in my mother's inbox unread. If my mother had used her email more actively, she might have found it herself, years before, but she could not read it, and she didn't know to look for it. If I had been more regularly involved in her email, I might have found it sooner, or I might not have, because I was not looking for that specific thing. The forwarding itself, why Brian Cho had forwarded David's email to my mother's address, remained unexplained. I tried to contact Brian Cho. He had closed his consulting business in 2020 and was not reachable. His role in the plan, and what had led him to forward the email, is something I do not have a complete answer to. Maybe he had a conscience. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he wanted a record somewhere that the plan existed. I don't know, but I am grateful. However it happened, the email was there, and it said exactly what it said. King County Superior Court, Judge Rebecca Lim, issued her ruling in January 2023. She voided the power of attorney on grounds of fraud in the inducement, finding that the document had been presented to my mother with material misrepresentations about its scope and purpose, without independent counsel, and in circumstances where the grantor's limited English proficiency was a specific factor in the exploitation. She voided all 8 filings made under the authority of that power of attorney. Parks Dry Cleaning, LLC was restored to its original member structure, my mother as sole member and manager, my father's estate as secondary interest. She found that the alleged capital contribution constituting David's ownership stake was unsupported by contemporaneous documentation and had been characterized fraudulently. The ownership interest was voided. She found elder financial exploitation under Washington RCW 74.34 and issued a civil judgment accordingly. She included in her ruling a specific paragraph regarding the email. She wrote, "The plaintiff has presented communication authored by the defendant in 2018, prior to the triggering events of 2019, which reveals a deliberate and premeditated plan to exploit family relationships and language barriers to acquire a family business." The court finds this evidence persuasive not only as to intent, but as to the full scope of the conduct, which was not reactive to circumstances, but designed in advance to take advantage of predictable vulnerability. The court declines to characterize what the defendant did as family assistance gone wrong. It was not assistance. It was exploitation. Planned before the circumstances, it was designed to exploit had even occurred. Christine read me that paragraph over the phone. I was at the shop. It was a Saturday. I was helping with the Saturday rush, which was still the Saturday rush my parents had served for 30 years. I stood in the back of the shop where my mother had spent 30 years learning what fabric can survive, and I held the phone, and I said, "Good." The criminal referral, handled by a colleague of Christine's, resulted in charges against David Park in March 2023, 2 counts of criminal exploitation of a vulnerable adult and 1 count of business fraud. He entered a guilty plea in August 2023. His sentence included restitution and probation. Brian Cho was named in a civil action that was settled before trial. The employees of Parks Dry Cleaning, who had continued showing up every day through all of it, received the back distributions they were owed. My mother opened the shop the Monday after the ruling the same way she had opened it every Monday for 30 years. My uncle David and I have not spoken since the deposition. Philip Malik divorced Carla. My brother Philip called me. David Park did not call me. I do not expect him to. I do not want him to. What I think about in the aftermath is my father. Not his illness, not the end, but the 30 years before. The Saturday mornings when I was small and the shop smelled the way it smelled and my parents were both there, both entirely themselves, doing the thing they had come to Seattle to do. My father at the counter knowing everyone's name. My mother in the back doing the thing that required knowing what fabric can survive. David had looked at that, at 30 years of my parents' work, at the specific expertise my mother had built with her hands over 30 years, at the community relationships that had made the business what it was, and had decided it was available to him, that it could be taken if the circumstances were managed correctly. He had been wrong about what it was. It was not a business that could be taken out of context and repurposed. It was 30 years of specific people making specific commitments. Without my mother's hands, without the community's trust, without the employees who had been there for 15 years, it was just a storefront. He had wanted the thing without understanding what it was made of. My mother, who understands exactly what it is made of, is still there. She is 59 years old now. She has hired a business manager, legitimately, with an attorney reviewing the arrangement, to handle the administrative side. She is still in the back. She is still doing the difficult garments. The hotel accounts are still there. The regulars are still there. The Saturday rush is still the Saturday rush. Mrs. Kim, next door, brings barley tea at 11 on weekday mornings. My mother goes over for 10 minutes and comes back. That is Park's dry cleaning. That is what my parents built. That is what I helped protect. The sign on the front of Park's dry cleaning has been there since 1991. It is a specific shade of dark green, not the same dark green as 312 Maple Street, but close, as if the families had independently arrived at a similar answer, with white lettering and a small outline of a clothes hanger in the corner. The sign has been repainted 5 times. The design has never changed. My father chose that design in 1991. He had a friend do the actual painting. He had no particular gift for sign making, but he had been specific about what he wanted. The green, the white letters, the hanger. He said, "It should look like we know what we're doing." They knew what they were doing. For 30 years, they knew exactly what they were doing. The sign is still there. It was still there while David was filing his documents. It was still there during the case. It is still there now. I drive past it on the way to my apartment. I look at it every time. Park's dry cleaning, still doing what it says. My father chose the color. My mother mixed the chemicals. They both knew exactly what they were building. It took everything David had to try to take it, and he still couldn't. Because you cannot take 30 years of knowing what you're doing. You cannot forge that on a document and file it with a county clerk. It lives in my mother's hands. It lives in the customers who have been coming for 25 years. It lives in the employees who showed up every day. It lives in the sign on the front of the building, in the specific dark green that my father chose, because it should look like we know what we're doing. It still does. Thank you for staying with this story. One practical thing: if you have family members who own a business and who have limited English proficiency or any other communication barrier, please make sure that any legal documents they sign have been reviewed by an attorney who works specifically for them, not an attorney who was arranged by another family member, an attorney whose duty is to the person signing. A power of attorney, improperly obtained, can undo decades of work. The appropriate safeguard is independent review by someone whose loyalty is clear. Also, check your email. Old forwarded emails that you never read may contain things you need to know. My mother's inbox held the answer for 4 years. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. Leave yours in the comments. Thank you.